Hey, what is going on, everyone? It's me, Mr. Mario, and in this video here, we're gonna just do something here a little bit fun, kind of random, and I'm going to just be providing commentary over this. I do not recommend, that is to say, I don't recommend people use this as a tutorial, because this is not meant to be a tutorial. So if anybody is seeing this and they're frustrated that, oh, I needed a little more detail here or something, just don't follow along with this. I don't even really recommend this specifically, but I'll explain why exactly I did what I did here. So in short, we are going to be building out the ideal Xbox 360 that I have wanted. At this point here, this is a system that really I would be putting in my game room. This is something that I have wanted for years. Now, I've actually had this console for a while here. I picked it up a few years ago, console only used. I felt like it was a good deal at the time. Unfortunately, it wasn't really in the best shape, and I kind of just put it off to the side knowing that I was going to work on this project at some point. That's how a lot of my hardware goes. But I finally ended up getting inspiration because one of my friends ended up wanting a Halo 4 Xbox 360 modded. He was able to find one, he picked it up, and then I ended up doing a RGH3 mod on that. And after I did that on his system, I was like, you know, I am really tempted to do this on mine now. And I actually did work on mine at one point. However, I found out, this wasn't fully the case. In short, I failed doing a RGH3 install on that. The PLL point, I just really scuffed that up on there. However, I'm now realizing it probably wasn't the PLL point that was the issue. It was probably the adapter I was using, and I get to that at one point for the postfix adapter. Either way here, what I am doing is I am building out the system that I have wanted. I've always loved the Xbox 360 Halo 4 edition. I've always thought it was a gorgeous system. I always thought it was cool that, to my understanding, this was the only version of the console that ended up having, from the factory, this is stock, it ended up having modified LEDs. So it has white LEDs, and then the cover that goes over the LEDs ends up kind of masking them so they show up as blue. And the controllers, I don't have the controllers, but the controllers also have blue LEDs on them. They really went all out on this system, knowing that this is going to be one of the last special edition Xbox 360s, so it's certainly a cool system to have. Now, to build it to my own specification here, I'm still one of those weird people, for my own personal system that I would actually use and not experiment with, I like to have Dual-NAND, because there are times I do just boot up into a stock environment and get onto Xbox Live. So for me, I like having Dual-NAND. I know most people aren't going to need it or want it or even see the point of it, and that is totally fine. Listen, I'm a weirdo, right? This is what I'm wanting to do here in 2023, at least while I was working on all of this. So that's what I wanted to do here. I wanted to take a Halo 4 system. I wanted to install a Dual-NAND mod on there so I can do both retail Xbox Live and also stay offline for the modded side all on one system. And I already have a system that does this, but I really wanted the Halo 4 system. And on top of that, I also want to flash the DVD drive. Again, something that people are probably going to see as completely useless at this point, but for me, I'm one of those people when I modify my systems, I do like to maximize them. So whenever I do a hard mod on an Xbox 360, I also like to flash the DVD drive. So there's going to be 3 different mods that I'm going to be doing here. First is going to be the RGH, second is going to be the Dual-NAND, and third is going to be the DVD drive flashing. So we're going to get into all of that here. Now, I said before that I tried to do RGH3 on here and I was not able to do it. So at this point here, I ended up having to go with another type of modification. There's a few that you can do, but I would say I have looked around, I've used this before, and I also spoke with Josh over from Octal's Console Shop, big shout out to him, just to verify this. And after talking with him, really he verified with me that if you're not going to be using PLL on a Slim, S-RGH is going to be the better mod that you can do on there, as opposed to any of the other options. However, if you are going to be scraping and using PLL on a Slim, you could either do RGH 1.2 or RGH 3. Just up to you if you want to use a chip or not. However, since I cannot use the PLL point on this system, I'm going to be going with S-RGH, and for that, I'm going to be using this chip here, which is going to be the Ace V3. Now for this here, for the most part, I ended up kind of following along with the Join the Resistance tutorial over on 7sins that they had written up for S-RGH on a 16 megabyte Slim, Trinity, or Corona, so big shout out and thank you to them. I also ended up referring to the RGH S-RGH page over on Console Mods because I felt like the glitch chip installation photo that they had for the X360 Ace Corona, that actually ended up being better, and it worked for me in this regard. So I would say I use those two references at least for the RGH side of house. So we're going to go microscopic with the footage at this point. Now, forgive me if the footage looks a little bit different here. I was actually working with and reviewing the OPQPQ microscope that had gotten sent over to me. So I was using it, and it wasn't super bad for the most part. It worked okay, but I just want to record this so I would get some more experience with it and also, work with it for a review. So here, the first thing I ended up doing was I, of course, had the system ripped apart, and then I went over to the NAND headers and I found, the ones that I would need for this. Now, this is a later Corona model, which is going to need the postfix adapter. However, it is a 16 megabyte, so that's why I was just using all of these points right here. Pretty simple for the most part. I just ended up going in, I used the X-Flasher 360 wires for this, and I just ended up wiring up everything accordingly. Once all that was done, I took my system over to my computer, and I ended up grabbing the latest version of JRunner with extras over from Octal's site, of course. That will be linked down below in the description. Now, I was more showing it here, but I already had a version installed, and I actually just got to use the auto update feature, so I updated to the latest release. But then what I did was I made sure I had my 360 plugged into power. I then ended up hooking up the X-Flasher from my computer over to the flasher itself, and then over to the Xbox. From there, I was able to make sure the console was detected, and I got 2 good NAND reads. I also did verify beforehand that the console was working and in good condition and all of that fun stuff, so we're all good there. I'm working with a good working console. So after I got my 2 good NAND reads, at this point, I actually modified the system technically. So I ended up creating the ECC for a Glitch 2 image, because we are going to be building this as a Glitch 2, and then I wrote it back to the console. However, at this point, the console is not working because we need a glitch chip to actually boot it up in this state. So once all this was done, I then ended up disconnecting the programmer from the computer and the console, and then I went back over to my table to continue work on this. Well, excuse me, before I did that, I actually worked on programming the glitch chip. So the glitch chip was a little bit funky to program here. I ended up going through the timing assistant, which was really great here. And I just ended up using, at first, the first recommended timing that it had here for a Corona using S-RGH. Then at this point, I took the X-Flasher, I hooked it up to my computer, I also plugged in the JTAG programming cable for the chip itself. I hooked that up to the chip, and I also hooked it up to the X-Flasher, of course. And whenever I would plug it in, I knew it was successful because it was giving me a red light. However, it was failing every single time. So there was a fix for this here, for me at least, which was use another USB port on my computer. Yeah, that was it. The USB port that I was using for the NAND operations, just fine. But that did not work for actually programming the glitch chip, so I had to use a different port, which was odd because I was thinking, a port that would be on the motherboard itself versus one on the case would be, okay, whatever. I'm not going to question it all too much here. Either way, I took the programming cable, and instead of soldering wires in, I just took a 6-pin pin header, connected it up, and then I physically pushed it into the X360 Ace. As you can see, when you do that and you apply pressure properly, you end up getting a red light, and then at that point, you can program the glitch chip. It just takes like 2 or 3 seconds, and once it's complete, JRunner will tell you that it's complete, and it will give you a nice green light on the glitch chip, meaning that it has been programmed. So at this point, the console is ready for glitching, the chip is ready for glitching and to do its job, so we need to actually get it all wired up. Now for this here, I ended up color coding my wires, and I figured I would answer this because I've had this asked a few times. A few people have asked, does it matter what color I'm using for my wires, or is that all aesthetic? No, it does not. The wire color does not matter. Like, you do not have to use black for ground or red for power. I just ended up doing that here for the aesthetic and just because, you know, it's easier to follow in this regard. And because I had all these colors available. But no, that's not that. So I will say here, this was one of my first mistakes. I ended up wiring up a ground wire here. Don't do this. No, don't do this. That is not... I think I was looking at an image from another site or something at one point that might have been incorrect, or now I know it's incorrect, but that was not a ground point. So no, I ended up fixing that one up later. However, over here, I ended up wiring up all the other wires that we needed here, so this is where a majority of them go, at least for a Corona, if you're doing one of these installs. So since this is a 5-volt chip, I ended up hooking up power into the 5-volt pad right here. I then also ended up using E and F because we are going to be doing I2C for this as opposed to PLL. So we need the E and F pads, so all I did was I just took some wires, I hooked up green into the E pad, and then I hooked up brown into the F pad. And for what it's worth, as you can see here, I did end up coming back later, but I'll pop it in here now. Directly next to the E-pad is where a ground is, so you're able to put 4 of these 6 wires real close right here. Now next up for our C point, which is going to be post, since I do not have a Corona version 1 or version 2, I needed a post-fix adapter. Now I already had one installed, and do keep in mind, it actually wasn't even installed properly. I had to go back later on and reseat this, and I ended up kind of having to push the push pin downwards itself, like physically pushing it downwards a bit as I was installing it in, and then I was finally able to make proper connectivity on all of this. However, this was simple enough. Once I got all set up here, I just ended up going to one of these pads here that I made sure had connectivity. I then hooked up a yellow wire to this, and this was going to be for my C point. So again, this is just for post. If you have a Corona version 1 or version 2, you can use it natively on the bottom of the board. I could not do that since I have a later revision Corona. And lastly, flipping the console over, I ended up using the D point here for CPU reset. Now, typically I end up using the CPU reset point that is underneath the X clamp, where you have to slightly remove the X clamp itself or just completely remove it. And I'll actually even show you all, I actually originally used that point. However, I ended up going back later on and I ended up using this point here, which is really close to a resistor. I've never used this point specifically for the CPU reset, but it seemed to do the job and work just fine. Plus, if you're doing your own install, it does make it quite a bit easier because you no longer have to worry about removing the X clamp itself. So there we go, we had all of the wires soldered into all the points, and at this point we kind of just have to get them all to the glitch chip itself. So I'd kind of found this area here that I felt like would be pretty suitable for the glitch chip. I know everybody kind of has their own spice and location of where they want to put a glitch chip. I felt like this worked here pretty well. So I end up taking the small bit of adhesive that was provided after I had cleaned up the area sufficiently. I end up, of course, placing it down on the console itself. Then I took the glitch chip and pushed it down as firmly as I could onto the system. So I was able to have easy access if I had to reprogram this, or of course if I had to cleanly solder everything up here, which I feel like I did, not the best, but I did an alright job managing my wires and such here. So just going right down the line, first of all I ended up doing the ground point, where I kind of did a little bit of a thing where I was able to go kind of like underneath the chip itself from the pad, and then I was able to kind of just come in on the side and I just soldered it in. So I felt like that looked alright. Next up I end up doing the 5 volts of power to actually give the chip some power. We have a long wire here for post, so this just came from the post-fix adapter and went right to the C pad on the chip. Next up is E. This is one of the I2C points that you need. So just took this short wire, well at least I had to shorten it down here, and kind of get it onto the board itself and tack it into the E pad. Next up is the other I2C point, which is F. Did the exact same thing. I came in here, I shortened it, and then I just end up tacking it to the glitch chip. And then D, this is the other long wire, the CPU reset one. Now, I felt like I probably could have shortened it a little bit more, especially, CPU reset, it is good to keep that short. However, it certainly wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been at the same time. I just came from the bottom of the motherboard to the top, came over here, and I kind of just got it into a nice clean point and got it soldered into the chip. Almost forgot about these points here, but you are going to need to take some small bits of wire and then bridge these 2 points here if you're going to be doing anything on a slim Corona, which involves I2C. So since we are going to be doing S-RGH, these are going to be a few pads that you will need to bridge. So now at this point, let's see how everything went. You might be excited to see where this goes, and I will tell you, when I hooked up everything initially, I would get a red dot immediately, right off the bat. I had a much longer section dedicated to the troubleshooting here, but honestly, I didn't really have any good footage here, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Octal was a huge help with this here. In short, there were 2 issues, one of them being the wrong ground point. So I ended up soldering this to the correct ground point, which you can now see. The next thing was that, embarrassingly enough, the postfix adapter was not seated properly. Once I was able to get it seated properly, we were in business. And sure enough, once I plugged it into power, I ended up seeing the red standby LED come on, but I did not see the green LED come on the glitch chip. But when I turned on the system, the green LED started flashing crazy like, and it was glitching, and it was able to boot up successfully. So I was able to get to Zell Reloaded, which was exactly what we needed. So what I did also, after I tried to turn it off and turn it back on a few times because I was in disbelief after just so much troubleshooting. This took way too long, you all. This took me way too long to get to this point. But after so much time troubleshooting on this, I was just in disbelief. Either way, what I did was I took a Ethernet cable, I hooked it up to the back of my console, so it was able to get onto the network, and then I went into JRunner, plugged in the local IP address, grabbed the CPU key itself, which was then finally able, after way too long, was finally able to decrypt the NAND on the system itself. So I ended up turning off the console because I had the information that I needed, and then I hooked it back up to the X-Flasher and hooked the X-Flasher up to my computer. From there, I was able to select the latest dashboard version. I ended up building a glitch 2 image, and this time around I ended up building this for SMC+, which is recommended for RGH 1.2 and S-RGH installs. So once I had SMC Plus applied, I ended up creating the XE build image, and then I was able to write the NAND back over to the system, meaning that I was finally able to actually have my modified system on deck. After it was written, I then ended up power cycling the system, so I disconnected power, connected it back up, also disconnected the X-Flasher from the computer and the console itself. Then I ended up turning on the system, and I was able to get it to boot up, as you can see. Now, there's nothing special here because there's no hard drive plugged in, so I don't have any homebrew here. However, as you can see, I am able to go over to my games, and I can go over to XEX menu, and I'm able to launch XEX menu, meaning that I can run homebrew, meaning that I have officially reset glitched hacked this system. So this was awesome. After way too long, you all, just after way too long, I finally had a third of this process complete. I ended up doing the RGH itself on the system with S-RGH, so that made me pretty happy. Now, for what it's worth, for some final touches on the RGH side, I did decide to end up going back to the glitch chip, and I ended up reprogramming it a few times. This is the glitch timing file that I ended up using for my own system here. It took me probably like 4 or 5 different files to see which one I felt like worked pretty well here. At this point, I noticed within 1, 2, maybe 3 cycles, it is consistently booting up. And I do want to give a little piece of advice for anybody who is, playing around with timing files on their glitch chip and such. When you are doing your install, it doesn't really matter how long it takes to boot at the beginning. When you're doing the installation itself, you just want to get it to glitch and boot up. because you want to make sure that you can get the information you need and you can modify the system. Once the system has been modified, what you want to do is you want to take the motherboard itself, plop it into the chassis, even screw it in as well too for extra measure, and then once it is in the chassis, at that point, you then go back and you play around with timing files to get the boot times pretty nice on there. So what I'm saying here is don't try and play around and fine tune the glitch timings and such while you are in the middle of the build. Wait until you are done with your build, then partially rebuild your system, mainly put it inside the chassis itself, and then play around with the timings. So there we go. That's all to say that the biggest portion I would say is now complete. We now have the system modified with S-RGH. Next up, we do now need to do Dual-NAND. Well, at least I need to, because again, I'm a weirdo. I want Dual-NAND on my system. For this here, there's really 3 parts that you're going to need if you are going to be doing a more modern method here. So you're not going to be using something like a Daemon, you'll be using some that's on the market, such as the Viper version 2. For this here, you'll need, of course, the Viper version 2, but you're also going to need the Corona adapter. This here, I guess you could wire up everything manually, but I don't want to do that. I really don't want to do that, so I just recommend spend a few extra dollars. You can pick up one of these Corona adapters. You then also pair that up with the Viper V2, and you essentially create a PCB sandwich when you are doing your Dual-NAND on a Corona. Now do keep in mind this only works for 16 megabyte Coronas. This does not work for the 4 gigabyte Coronas unless you downgrade them to 16 megabyte. So just keep that in mind for this. Now I do want to say here another big shout out. I did want to shout out Legend of Rock 420 over for his really great guide in regards to this here. Now I've had some experience with the Viper installs because I've done one on my Trendy before. I also ended up previously doing one on a RGH3 system. Yes, you did hear that right, and there is a reason. The main reason you can only do RGH3 with the Viper version 2 on a Corona, just because that's the only one that allows you to boot retail still without wiring in place. But either way, I did want to have a couple shoutouts here. One for Legend of Rock 420 with his pretty darn great tutorial that he had written up on here. And on top of that, also Element from the mod shop itself. Not only for really creating these tools here, but also not for this install, but a previous install. I had picked his brain a little bit and, you know, he gave me some guidance and assistance in regards to that, just so I knew how the Viper itself worked and such. However, Legend, if you're watching, 1, you're an awesome dude, and 2, I thought you should know that your guide was so good that the creator of these chips actually recommended it to me. So just keep that in mind. I hope that helps, and I hope that puts a smile on your face. Either way, this is what I ended up doing. Now, since I've been working on the top of the motherboard this entire time, I then ended up flipping the motherboard upside down, and I ended up finding this area right here, which is where the Corona adapter ends up going into. You see on the Trinity, you can just put the Viper 2 itself, just bare metal, onto the motherboard, but on the Corona you cannot do that. You need the adapter, and then you need to plop the Viper on top of it. So what I ended up doing is I found the area here, and I ended up kind of moving it around and making sure it was in a good spot like this. And then once you find exactly where it needs to go, I would also highly recommend keeping this in place temporarily with some tape. Don't worry, we don't need to keep the tape here. Don't do anything permanent just yet. We just need to put this in place. And from here, we then need to start anchoring it. So I would recommend, make sure the area is clean, but then also take some flux, take a bit of solder, bring in your soldering iron, and just start tacking in a few of these points. Once you end up tacking in a few of them, or really even all of them here at this point, I then ended up removing the tape itself here, but I noticed kind of at the top or at the bottom, however you're looking at this, of the Corona adapter itself, it was kind of floating off the board a little bit. So what I did was on the opposite end of the Corona adapter, I ended up physically pushing it down towards the motherboard, and then I ended up anchoring 1 or 2 more points, again just with some flux and some solder. So that way it was nice and flat and flush against the motherboard itself. So there we go. Now that it's anchored, you can finish up the rest of your points. And this here, you're just going to watch. It's pretty self-explanatory for the most part. You really just go in here, you see each point that needs to be soldered from the Corona adapter itself onto the motherboard, and you just go to each of those points, take a little bit of flux, dab it on there, and then tack in a little bit of solder. And if you are kind of questioning any of the points, because you need to make sure, double and triple check they are making good connections, they have good joints between the board and the motherboard itself. If you need to touch up any of these points, you can go ahead and do that, just either introduce new solder or just touch them up real quick with your soldering iron to make sure everything has flowed and heated up properly. That's what I ended up doing as well, just to make sure that everything was all good. Because here's the thing, if you mess up one of these points here, it's going to be super annoying to get back to it because you have to remove the Viper to get back to this point. So you might as well just do it right the first time as opposed to having to go back and redo it. So awesome, that was all good. At this point here, because we are going to pretty much kiss the sunlight goodbye in regards to this here, the adapter, it's never really going to see anything again. So make sure everything is nice and clean. And with that, this is where you want to clean a little bit. Just take something like Q-tips and isopropyl alcohol and clean up all of the points here incredibly well. Just clean them up super well. This is really the cleaning you're going to want to do at this point because you can't come back to this specific adapter here. So I made sure everything was super nice and clean right here. And once it was clean, I was then able to introduce the Viper version 2. And like I said, it is essentially a PCB sandwich. What you need to do is, it's pretty obvious how you need to set it up, thankfully. And again, huge shout out and thank you to Element for doing this here. This was a breezy install, man. But what you need to do is just make sure it lines up properly on top of the Corona adapter. And you should see where all the pads on the Viper version 2 line up with the Corona adapter itself. And then maybe the hardest part here, because it's going to be a little bit lopsided, like the adapter is not big enough to end up supporting the entire Viper. So you're going to need to kind of awkwardly secure it down temporarily with some tape. I guess what I did, I kind of just ended up taping it only on the side, and that was able to work. But once you get it nice and flat and stable enough yet again, you're going to need to anchor this down. So what I did here was I actually went from the opposite side. As opposed to doing all these small little points here, I end up coming up to the top and I end up tacking in the 3v3 as well as ground points. And once those were all good, I then ended up doing the other smaller points right here. Again, these are all going to be super obvious, they are marked, but you're going to clearly see the points on the Viper V2 that need to be tacked into the points on the adapter itself. And it's the exact same logic right here. You're going to need to make sure everything is clean, then dab each of these with a little bit of flux, and then introduce some fresh solder here. And if there's any points that you doubt, you can easily go back and touch up on these points yet again. So now that I felt like everything was pretty secure, there's now going to be these 8 small points right here, which I don't know if I was just off my game or what, but man, I'll tell you, I was coming in here and I ended up bridging these points. And I am going to show you all this. It was a little bit frustrating, but there's a pretty easy way that you can fix that. Really, if you end up bridging these points together, what I recommend doing is make sure your soldering iron is still hot, make sure you have a very clean tip, and then what you're going to do is just very quickly just run between all the points incredibly quickly. And what you're able to do at that point is you're then able to spread the solder across all of the pads right there, and you end up separating it in the process. And if it's not separated, just keep trying at it a little bit at a time very quickly with a clean tip until you're able to get them separated. So there you go. As you can see, I did not have to use any type of braid. I didn't have to use any type of desoldering tools. I ended up just using a hot soldering iron. However, even with that lacking a little bit, I was able to get all 8 of these points right here, and right there, you're all good to go. So all the points that solder from the Viper version 2 onto the Corona adapter itself are now complete. Now we can work on the actual other points and pads on the Viper version 2 itself. Now here's going to be one point that is super easy to miss, so make sure you do it here if you're going to be doing this. Over on the corner of the Viper V2, you're going to see 2 pads underneath J1. You just want to dab these with a little bit of flux and then solder them and bridge them together so that J1 jumper is enabled. Next up, you're going to see these 6 points right here that you're supposed to solder wires to. Since we're doing this on a Corona, we only need 4 of them. Don't worry, we're still going to be doing 6 wires, but we only need 4 of these pads. Here's the thing, we can completely ignore the 5V and chip pads. The ones that we do need to prepare are going to be SMC, BTN, LED, and RB. So there we go, our Viper version 2 is completely prepared at this point. So let's go ahead and start working on the wires themselves. So there's going to be an area of the motherboard that you're going to be looking for, and it's actually going to be one of the headers that you've already had to solder to before, but this time we're going to be on the bottom of the motherboard. So there's going to be 3 wires that you need to solder in here. First of all, we're going to need ground. So I'm just going to solder in a black wire for our ground point. We're also going to need power to the Viper itself. So we're going to find the 3v3 point and solder a red wire to that, which is exactly what I did. And finally, we're going to need the pad for SMC. So it's going to be this one just directly next to or underneath 3v3. Just go ahead and solder a blue wire to this. At least I ended up using a blue wire to denote this here. So half of our wires are done. That's great. Next up, there's going to be a point that is going to be very close or pretty much underneath the south bridge itself, but it's going to be next to one of the holes. It's going to be this R2, R1 point. It's quite small, and this is going to be for RB. So you're just going to take a wire and solder it into RB. There we go, we're 2/3 of the way done. So now there's 2 more wires to solder in. Now we need to come to these pins right here, which this is going to be on the bottom of the motherboard, of course, but these are all interfacing with the actual RF board itself. And we're going to be soldering this into RF pin 13 right here. This is going to be for the BTN or button pad. So again, for the button pad, you're just going to find pin 13 and solder it in right here. Now next up, to make things a little bit easier for myself, there's also a LED that you have to solder to, but as opposed to soldering to the RF board itself, I wanted to use the pins right here. So you can actually find this point over here, and you can solder a wire up here, and you're going to solder the other end to the LED pad on the Viper version 2 itself. However, do keep in mind there is a slight modification you have to do for this here. Either way, this is our final wire. So this one here is going to be for the LED wire. But real quick, before I forget, I'm going to show you all how you can make this LED wire work. Now there was one part I forgot to show you all, which is going to be an LED. You will need any LED color, it doesn't matter what color it is, but you're going to need a 0603 sized LED, and you're going to need to install it onto the actual RF board itself. This is going to be to signal which NAND you have activated once you have the dual NAND operations all set up on the console itself. So I'm going to admit something to you all, I absolutely hate soldering in small LEDs like this. I really don't like doing it. I am not a fan of it, but I'll show you what I did for the most part here. So what you'll need to do is take your RF board, and you're going to need to find one of the negative points. Now I like to use the first quadrant right here, and for the negative points you can just look at the already existing LEDs themselves, and the negative points for the LEDs are going to be where the white circles are silk screened. So you see that there is a white circle to the right of this LED here. That means that that is the negative pad. So here you're now going to have to do a little bit of damage and scrape away at this. What I did was I took an X-Acto knife and I ended up just scraping away the grounding here to end up revealing this and see what we could actually work with on the actual RF board itself. So you're just going to need to scrape away a little bit like this. I'd recommend don't go absolutely crazy, but give yourself a nice healthy amount to work with here. Something like this will do just fine, and then from there, once you have it nice and scraped away, you can then go in here with some isopropyl alcohol and some Q-tips, make sure it's nice and clean, then bring in some flux, introduce some solder so you have a nice base to work with, And then at this point, you now need to bring in a 0603 LED. Now, lucky for me, I was actually able to keep this all consistent. You see, the Halo 4 system has white LEDs on it, and I had white LEDs on deck. So I end up just adding this here, so it still ends up looking blue at the end once everything is all installed. For this, the way I remember it is flip the LED upside down, and the pointy side, so the side that this symbol is pointing towards, is going to be pointing to the negative side. Then once you flip it right side up, you can then just come here and tack it in. Now I do want to show you all my left-handed soldering skills here because I was a little bit proud of this. What I did with my right hand was I ended up taking some tweezers, I held it in place, and then my left hand I came in here real quick with my hot soldering iron and a little bit of solder at the end of it, and I ended up just tacking it onto this side. And we're all good. However, spoiler alert, that's all to say that that doesn't really matter all too much, because as I was getting the wire soldered in for this, I ended up accidentally ripping the LED off. So I had to just throw that LED away, grabbed another LED, and then plopped it on there. It was like everything that could have gone wrong with this system ended up going wrong. However, as you can see, I was able to get the negative side of this LED soldered into the negative scrape that I had created. And then for the positive side, you'll just want to do the exact same thing. You can go ahead and prepare this with some flux, with some solder, and then just take a small piece of wire. I use 30 gauge wire, like single core, like solid core wire for all of this, but I end up taking a piece of 30 gauge wire. I end up soldering it to the end here, and this is going to be the important part. When you come down to this section of the RF board itself, you're going to solder in the other end of that wire right here. That is going to connect to the positive end of the new LED that you have installed. And on top of that, that is what's going to allow the mod that we did to work. Alternatively, what you would normally need to do is solder in the LED pad from the Viper V2 over to the positive point on the new LED we installed. However, like I said, I really don't like running a wire from the board to the RF board. So therefore, this is how you're able to do this. So we are all done with our RF board successfully modified. Everything should be working once we have it installed, so we don't have to worry about the RF board. Now that the RF board is completed, let's go back over to the motherboard and wrap up the Dual-NAND. So this is going to be the interesting thing here, right? Typically when you install the Viper into a Trinity, you are, as I said, soldering it directly onto the motherboard itself, so you're tapping directly into ground and 3.3 volts. However, we don't have that capability here, so what you're going to need to do is solder in those 2 points directly. Now we've already prepared all the wires, so what you want to do is take your 3v3 volt wire, so the red wire, and just solder it into the 3.3 volt pad or area on the actual Viper version 2 itself. Since we can't tack it into that directly, we have to bring it over to the chip itself. Once 3v3 is done, you're going to do the exact same thing with the black ground wire. Just grab that wire, make sure it is cut accordingly, and solder it into the GND point or pad on the Viper version 2 itself. So now let's work on getting all the wires installed to the rest of the pads. What I'm going to do here is take my purple wire, which is for RB. I'm going to, of course, trim and strip it accordingly, and then solder it up into the RB pad on the Viper V2. So there we go. Next up, we're going to do the exact same thing with LED. This is going to be a pretty long wire, so the exact same thing here. Just measure it out, make sure it is cut accordingly, stripped, and then go ahead and solder it into the LED pad. Right next to LED, since we did our mod for that, we're going to grab the button wire. So it's going to be the one that was soldered into pin 13. Just grab that other one. For me, I ended up using green, and I actually ended up accidentally measuring it properly here. But what I did here was just make sure it was stripped properly, and then I soldered it into the BTN or button pad on the Viper. And finally, we need SMC reset. So it's going to be the blue wire that I soldered in earlier. I'm just going to grab that wire, make sure it is cut and stripped accordingly, and then solder it into SMC. And there we go. For this specific configuration, we are all done. Now, I do mention that here because I have not covered it, but this here was specific for 5 volt glitch chips, which is what the Ace version 3 is. However, if you have a 3v3 such as something like a Matrix or a Cool Runner, it's going to be a little bit different. So just keep that in mind. If you want to, go ahead and refer to Legend of Rock 420's guide on that if you are using a 3v3 volt chip, but this here specifically works for a 5 volt chip. So now with all that completed, we can go ahead and make sure everything works. Well, hold on, I end up cleaning everything here. So what I did, because I was gonna, have this on my desk and such, I ended up going in and I went to all the points that I soldered to, really on the Viper and on the motherboard itself, and just took some isopropyl alcohol, Q-tips, and cleaned them up as best as I could. Once I had everything cleaned up, I then went over and decided to hook up the console to power and to TV. Now you're able to tell this works because when you plug it in, if everything was done successfully, that new LED you installed should blink one time. That means that the first NAND is activated, which is the Viper V2. So if the Viper V2 is activated, you are all good. However, if you try to turn on the system, don't panic when you realize that absolutely nothing is happening. Right now, you can't do anything because the NAND is blank and you can't do anything with nothing. But what you can do is hold down the sync button for 2 seconds. It should blink 2 times now, meaning that the second NAND is activated, which is the onboard system NAND, which is the side that we've already modified. You can now turn on the system, and if it boots up successfully, that means that the Viper V2 is working as expected. However, we need this to actually be populated with something. So what you can do is turn off the system, hold down the sync button for 2 seconds so it goes back to the first NAND, and then hook up your NAND flasher to the console and to your computer itself. It has been recommended to flash the same NAND that you have over here, so I'm actually just going to take my UPD flash, which is the modified side here, and just flash it over to the Viper V2. Element had recommended this to me before just so you can test and verify that the Viper is actually working, but this is not going to be how it will work in the end. So all I did was write the NAND over to here, and so I now have the same NAND written twice on both sides of the system. But what we can do now is test it. So I then disconnected the flasher from my computer and from the console itself, unplugged it from power, plugged it back in, we ended up getting one blink, and I turned it on. And sure enough, the console was able to glitch, it was able to boot up properly, showing that the Viper version 2 NAND is working successfully. And sure enough, if I turn off the system, hold the sync button for 2 seconds, wait for it to blink twice, and turn it on, the NAND is now working on the console itself. However, this is not what we want. We do want 2 different NANDs on the system, not just the identical one written over twice. So what I can do now is turn off the system and completely power cycle it, or just flip back over to the first NAND, and now we're going to write retail to it. Typically, for most people, the ideal use, I guess, or intended use for this is going to be the first NAND will have retail, the second NAND will be modified. That's how I'm going to use it. There's no right or wrong way to do it, but that's the order of operations I'm going to use. So what you can do is make sure NAND 1 is activated and then go back over to JRunner. Now I did end up making a copy of the UPD flash file and I ended up renaming it because this is going to get recompiled and it will be overwritten. Once that is copied and renamed, we can go back over to JRunner, and this time around we're still going to do the latest dashboard, but we're going to select retail and we're going to make this a clean SMC. And then what you'll need to do is build a XE build image, which is going to be the retail NAND, and then flash it over to whichever side you want. In my case, I'm going to flash it to the first NAND, which is going to be the Viper. Once that has been flashed over, you can then disconnect the flasher yet again from the console and your computer, unplug the system, plug it back in, and when you get one blink, you can turn on the system. When you turn on the system, it should just boot up normally here, but this should be a completely retail side, which is exactly what I wanted right here. So this is great. I even tested this here by going over to games with my USB drive and I couldn't find XEX menu. But sure enough, if I go over to settings and go into storage and go to game demos, it shows up as corrupted media, which ironically is exactly what I want, because that means that this is a retail NAND and that is what I want. I can now turn off the system, then hold down the sync button for 2 seconds, it will then blink twice, and I can boot the system back up. At this point now, it is going to be booting up into a modified NAND. So I can test this by going over to games, or of course going back over to the system settings, storage, game demos, and I can find XEX menu right there in all of its glory, meaning that this is a modified NAND that I can run homebrew on. So at this point here, We're now 2/3 of the way done. The system is pretty close to being done now. This is getting close to what I've wanted, but we now have a dual NAND system operating successfully. The other thing I want here is the ability to play my backup games on here on either side, whether it be retail side or whether it be on the modified side from disk. So what I'm going to do is now flash the DVD drive. Unfortunately, you cannot do that for the 16D5S. These drives, the Slim Hitachi drives and the DG16D5S Lite-On drives for the Slim, cannot be flashed. So if you want to flash them, what you actually have to do is install one of these here, which is a unlocked LTU2 PCB. You then have to build a firmware for it, flash it over, and install it in the system. Well, you have to install it first, but the point is here, you do need to do this, and in order to do all of this, you have to RGH the system. So doing it in this order of operations was necessary. For this here, you actually need JRunner for this. You need to plug in your NAND, make sure that you can decrypt it, and then you need to go over to NAND and click on extract files, and it will be able to extract all of the sensitive files of the NAND itself. Two of the files that you actually need in order to build out your custom firmware for your drive. However, for the drive firmware itself, we do need to install the PCB into the drive. So what I am doing here is I'm just going in, yet again using the microscope, but I'm going in here and I have opened up my DVD drive. Now, it's not too hard to swap these over here. However, I do recommend you really do need some tweezers for this because these wires are like cut ideally perfectly to length and you cannot fit your fingers in there. Either way, what you can do here is make sure you take apart the drive, at least get the back cover off, and then release the 3 ribbons that are holding the drive in place. There's also going to be a couple of tabs that you're going to need to release, and there's going to be 1 screw. But there's also going to be these 5 wires, and for these here, all you really need to do is take your hot soldering iron, tap each point for a few seconds, and then lift up and remove each of these wires from the PCB itself. Once all of that has been done, you can then free your old PCB, and then you can take your nice new LTU2 PCB and go ahead and install this in backwards. It is going to take a little bit of finagling to physically put it in place, but what you can do is make sure it pops into place properly, make sure it tabs back in. You can then take your screw and screw that back in, then take the 3 ribbons that you had released and attach them to this board itself. And lastly, there's going to be these 5 wires that you have to solder in here. So this here, I would say, was actually the hardest soldering, ironically enough. I actually haven't run into this, but you're just going to see right here, what I did was I took a little bit of flux paste, I applied it to these 5 points here on the PCB, but you'll see that when I heat up these pads and I introduce the solder, it just doesn't flow well. For whatever reason, it does not flow very well, it just doesn't look good. And if you've been watching the video up until this point, you can see that I didn't have any issues with all the other stuff, but these pads here in particular, for some reason, the solder just wasn't flowing quite right. I did kind of have to just manually move it around on the pads themselves, but we were able to make it work is what I'm saying. From here though, you just take your tweezers and you're going to work backwards. And you know, having the odd solder pads right there, it made it a little bit more difficult, but it's really just going to be the same logic. You're just going to heat up each solder pad and then take each respective wire held with a pair of tweezers and get it soldered into place. And as you can see here, there is barely any room you really have to work with. You pretty much have little to no wiggle room. So that's why I really recommend here, you really do need the tweezers. But I was able to successfully get all 5 of the wires in place. So at this point here, the drive has physically been modified and our work here is done. So you can now go ahead, close up the drive, put all the screws back in place, and we're now going to need to hook it up to a computer with Jungle Flasher, because right now this drive is blank, so it's not going to be able to do anything. I didn't do any physical recording of my gear here, but I did end up doing a screen capture, so this is what I ended up doing. Alright, so since the last time I flashed one of these drives, I've upgraded from Windows 10 to Windows 11 on my main desktop, and it's introduced some more issues that I just don't really want to figure out troubleshooting. So I'm showing you all my secret weapon right here, which is my laptop that I got 12 years ago that has Windows 7 on here, and as you can see, there's pretty much nothing on here. I just have this dedicated as This is pretty much just a dry flashing laptop at this point because I nuked it and I set it up like this a few years ago. And whenever I need to flash a drive, I pull this thing out, and typically if I'm not able to do it on my main desktop, I can do it here. Yeah, I know I could accomplish the same thing pretty easily on a VM. I just haven't set up a VM at this point, but I still have this laptop here, so it's all good. However, thankfully, I always keep this thing in test mode, and since I never really like do anything or connect to the internet or any of that fun stuff, the X360 USB Pro V2 is hooked up, so we are all good to go at that point. Let me go ahead and I had to copy over some stuff. I end up getting Jungle Flasher itself. I have 0.95 on, 0.1.95 on here, but I ended up copying the latest one, which was 0.1.96. So let's go ahead and fire this thing up. And this is cool, right? I bet I'm showing something here while I'm recording this in 2023 that can't really be done on many other things. And I'm not talking about the drive flashing, I'm talking about these old ads that you're going to see on the side. At one point in the past, when I used Jungle Flasher on this computer, all of these ads were still up and running, the sites were up and running, so they are just kind of forever cached on this drive until it ever goes bad or I format it or what have you. But either way, the X360 USB Pro is detected. It is running the latest 0.20 firmware, so we will be able to flash over a 16D5S, but there's no drive detected because I haven't powered it up yet. So let me go ahead and I'm going to supply external power to the drive. I've now powered the X360 USB Pro. I'm going to power cycle this, and actually I just realized it's probably going to say there's no drive detected still because there is the drive board is blank. There's nothing on here. It doesn't know what to do. So admittedly, I'm going to have to see what all to do here because flashing these drives is a little bit odd. And actually, let me set up the firmware on here real quick. So yeah, that will be important. This is what I need to do. I need to open up the target firmware. I'll go over to the Jungle Flasher directory, firmware. The one I am looking for, it is LTU2, and I just don't remember which one it is. So while I'm doing this on the side on my main desktop, I'm going to have a document open. And for anybody wondering what firmware I'm going to have, if you get Jungle Flasher, one cool thing they did in the documentation here, they had this entire big PDF here, so I'm just going to be looking at that on the side. All right, so this is what I was thinking here. We're going to go to, which one is it? LTU2. We're going to get the 1175. There we go. So that is Executor LTU2, 1175 LTU2 version 1.0. And the OSIG is PLDS DG16D5S 1175, which is exactly what we need. Now, this is the hidden thing. You need to right click this and you need to, where is it? Key CR. That's what you need to click. So there's these two files, and remember at one point when I extracted these from the NAND? Well, that's what I need here. There we go. We have both the key and the CR for this. And I've learned this the hard way. You can't just take the key file and like manually flash it. Quite literally, if you build this firmware without the cr.bin, it just won't be able to play any games and such. So we got to hit OK. And it's thinking really hard. And here we go. It's giving us a file to work with. So I'm going to call this LTU2 CFW, just something like that's fine, and save. And there we go. We have this all locked and loaded in here, so our firmware is all ready to go at this point. All right, so here's the fun thing that I didn't quite remember 100%, but this is apparently the order we're supposed to do things to get this to work. So again, the X360 USB Pro, it has to be on the latest version 0.20 firmware, which is why I highlighted that before. But we need to hit intro device ID. But here's the thing, there's fat, there's slim 2. You're going to be tempted to pick slim? No, you're supposed to pick fat for this. I know, it goes against what we're thinking, but you're supposed to hit fat. And from what I've seen as well, you're also supposed to turn off the drive. So that's what I'm doing. This worked for me before. I physically turned the drive off. I'm hitting intro device ID. Gonna wait for this to do its thing. And we're going to hit yes. So it's now resending the vendor command. I'm going to turn the drive on. There we go. It is in 0.72. And there we go. We have it in vendor mode. That is beautiful. That is exactly what we need. And at this point here, again, the drive is in vendor mode. We have everything set up. 0x72 is our status. Our firmware is right here. Everything is loaded up within the firmware tool, so that is important. And right here, it looks like we can just hit write. So it's doing its thing. Take a look at that. It is writing to bank 0, 1, 2, 3. And then it's going to verify all 4 of those banks. So there's our verification test. This is, trust me, this probably looks pretty easy right now, but I went through a lot of troubleshooting last year to get this all to work properly. And then at this point, we can now hit outro ATA reset. So let's do that. And would you look at that? We have the PLDS DG16D5S. We have all this stuff. And as best practice from back in the day, they always said, you know, do outro ATA reset twice, just in case. So thankfully, if you have everything in place, this is a 2-step process. We just did the first step there. Now the second step, we're going to lock the drive itself. I'll explain why we're doing that. So again, I physically turned off the drive. I'm going to hit FAT. I'm going to hit intro device ID. Wait a little bit. Funny thing is too, this laptop has a DVD drive, so whenever I do anything significant in Jungle Flasher, I can hear the internal drive resetting. I'm gonna hit yes and turn on the drive. We're at 51, so off on, off on. Might have to do this a few times. There we go. All right. As you can see, it took like 10 times to do that, but we're now in vendor mode. So now at this point, we're going to lock the drive. The reason why we're doing this here is because these drive boards come as unlocked. Now, technically, I think I could pop this into my RGH and it will work just fine. But it was always a thing of if you're going to be using this and have it live safe and everything, you need to relock the drive. And since there's going to be a retail side on this, I do want to relock the drive here just to have it, you know, be all standard and such. So for this, we're already in vendor mode. I'm going to hit 0x00. And here we go. This is intended for the, check this out, both of these PCBs, although it's fine, we're doing the D5S. You should not attempt to lock a fat light on. Doing so, you will erase this. Okay, we're good. And there we go. Our SPI status is now 0x8C, which means it is locked. And now at this point, we can do outro ATA reset. And there we go. We're all good. And we can do it one more time, outro ATA reset. And as you can see, I mean, right here, this part probably looks like the easiest part out of everything, but there was a lot of troubleshooting to get to this point. So I think we're done with 3 out of 3 mods on this so far. That's awesome. We did the S-RGH, we did the Dual-NAND, and now we did the drive swap here, and we flashed it. So now, as you can see, for our final piece here, I'm able to take a backup game that I have burned and backed up and patched properly, not specifically in that order, but the point is I can now do that. I can take that disc, I can pop it into the DVD drive, and it successfully works on both the retail side and the modified side. So at this point here, we're 3 for 3. We have S-RGH, Dual-NAND, and a flash DVD drive in a Halo 4 system, which is exactly what I have wanted. Now, would it have been the exact mod I wanted? No, in all honesty, it would have been nice to be able to do RGH3 on here, but my own fault there. I had some mess ups on there. But the point is, this system has frustrated me so much. It has been laughing at me, just silently in the corner laughing at me, and I have finally annihilated and done everything I wanted to on it. Plus, S-RGH is booting quite nice on here, thankfully, so I think we're all good on that. Now, one other thing that I did was, unfortunately, I did notice that this system wasn't really treated well in its past life, so after I did all of this, I actually waited a few days because I took all the plastics, ripped them apart, ended up giving them a nice bath in soap and warm water, and really cleaned them up really well. I don't know what was happening beforehand to this system. I didn't take any before pictures, but it looks like someone really scuffed and scratched it up while also trying to feed it a hot pocket at one point through either the fan grate or the USB ports. Thankfully, everything works on the system. That's really cool, but it certainly was not in the best shape, and it looks okay now. But at least it's clean, thankfully. So either way, this is now my system. Like, this is going to be my personal system that I enjoy and I play games on, and it is going to replace the previous one that I had, which was actually a S-RGH Dual-NAND Trinity system that I worked on several years ago in kind of a collaboration review type thing with the mod shop. He had sent over that old system, he sent over the glitch chip to me, and it was really to do an install video and a review of the Viper version 1 at that point. However, the Viper version 2 is nicer, it's great, and I'm able to replace my system with more mod shop part systems, so that's cool. So that is about it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all got to maybe learn something, just be entertained overall. This was a fun build to do, even though it was tiring, even though there was so much troubleshooting I had to do on this thing. But ideally, this is now at the point where this is the system that I have wanted. I know for the original Xbox, for example, some people, they really love the Mountain Dew Xbox, and they like their dream is to get one of those and then mod it up and do all the other fun, crazy things with it. This was pretty much my dream here. This is the ideal system that I wanted. I wanted the Halo 4 system. I wanted those nice blue looking LEDs. I wanted this nice case here. I wanted the weird sounds that it makes. Like, this is what I wanted. So I'm quite happy. This is quite literally, again, stressing this here, this is my system that I'm going to be using. This will be the one that is in my game room for anybody who is wondering. So I think that's about it. That was a fun install. I'm so glad I have this done now, in all honesty. I'm so glad it's done. So it really feels like I kind of got something off my chest here now. But either way, that's about it for this video. If you've made it to the end, seriously, thank you all so much. It has been much appreciated for you, like, hanging out and just with all of this. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, a like would absolutely be appreciated. Show your appreciation there. That would be great. If you didn't like it, a dislike is fine as well too. Maybe I should have done RGH3. Maybe I shouldn't have screwed it up in the first place. But you know what? It's done now. The system is liberated. It's upgraded. It's dual-nanded. It's flashed. It's a good system now. Anyways, again, that's about it for this video here. But as I always say, this is Mr. Mario signing off. Thank you all for watching, everyone.